Hello, my name is Brian Martin, and you are listening to episode 3 of season 3 of the Running Technique Tips podcast. This season we're talking all things cross-country and road racing and training. And Lisa's been doing a lot of talking about cross-country this week. You had a big interview with Andrew about his complete history of cross-country running. How was that?
I did. I've been a busy little beaver this week. I had mentioned last week that I'd started reading through Andrew Hutchinson's book. He wrote The Complete History of Cross-Country Running because you and I were having to admit that we actually didn't know anything about the history of cross-country running. And I finished the book and then had a really good chat with Andrew. And, sometimes when you haven't met someone, Andrew lives in the States, and you just start talking about something that's a common interest. And literally the hour we went, I think we spoke for about an hour, and it honestly felt like about 10 minutes. So it was great and highly, highly knowledgeable.
Yeah, you went deep into cross-country. You must have really, really hit it off. You went full cross-country nerd.
I was a total cross-country nerd during the week, and I actually really enjoyed it because it made me realise even more and more this sport that, is sort of forced upon you throughout, in Australia starting from primary school, and I'm pretty sure in other areas across the world it's a similar thing. You go through the schooling system and everyone has a school cross-country, and it's sort of something that you just do but don't really know anything about.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I actually haven't had a chance to have a listen yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that when I do the edit of the show after we speak. But apparently Andrew was quite impressed with your background knowledge and research and the fact that you'd actually read his book.
Yeah, well, as I said, I spent, a bit over a week. It's quite a lengthy book, and for listeners, we'll put all of the details up in the show notes. But when you realise that there's over 200 years of history to go back on, there's a reason why it's, a lengthy book. And Andrew does a really good job of detailing sort of decade by decade, and then even eras in sport, women in running, the Olympics. And so it gets really, really detailed. So I've totally nerded out over the last week. It was great.
That's good. That's good. Is there any particular highlight that you could share with the listeners to encourage them to listen to the end of the episode where we're going to have that interview?
Do you know what? There's a couple of things. And one thing, I'm glad you brought this up, because last week you asked me how far the initial Olympians in the first 3 Olympics actually ran, and I had no idea. And so I did quiz Andrew on this, and it actually changed because way back in 1912, when they first held the cross-country in the Olympics and then cross-country as a sport, it wasn't quite mature enough to have formalised distances and competitions as such. So it was all a bit over the place, but it was around about 10.5 to 12 kilometres over the 3 different Olympics.
Okay, so that's pretty similar distance to the World Cross Country Championships.
Yeah, very similar. But a couple of really interesting things is we touch on the potential of the Olympics, cross-country making a return in the Olympics, and Andrew and I talk quite in detail about that, and that's something that he's incredibly passionate about and advocating for very heavily.
Excellent.
And we also...
Well, now we're talking about it on this podcast. It's bound to happen.
Well, exactly. And the other thing that we talk about actually is the World Cross Country Championships. And then, although not necessarily something that really targets some of our listeners with the sort of the elite end, but we chat a little bit about a bit of its demise and where it's heading. And Andrew's got a little bit of a interest, or actually a very big interest in that, and obviously with it being held in Australia in the next couple of years, we touch on that too. And
is he coming out?
Well, and you will have to listen, but he said that he would, and I have volunteered you and I to race him.
We might get flogged because he's a pretty handy runner, isn't he?
Well, he called himself a mid-packer as well, but from memory, I think he said his 5K time was maybe around 17-ish minutes. So he is a little bit quicker than you. Actually, he's a lot quicker than you and I at the moment. But look, we've got 2 years to bridge that gap.
I'm a bit worried that I might be just going backwards in that time, but anyway, we'll see what we can do.
Oh dear, but anyway, it was a really fun chat. Worth a listen if you're, a cross-country advocate or even someone who's just curious as to really how a sport evolved that's still in existence, over 200 years later. Okay, and today I am joined by a special guest, Andrew Hutchinson, who wrote The Complete History of Cross-Country Running. And I want to welcome Andrew to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, no worries. Well, as Brian and I have been talking about over the past 2 or 3 weeks, we're delving into cross-country running, and because it's heading into the Australian winter season. And one of the things that we were both interested in was to learn a little bit more about the history of cross-country running. And I have been running cross-country since I was in primary school, and I actually had to admit that I knew nothing about its origins. And then I came across your book and have been completely blown away. So can you tell me just a little bit about your history and a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I grew up in the United States, in California, on the West Coast, in the Bay Area. And from a young age, I was running frequently in holiday races and 5Ks and the like. But I was never a premier athlete, was never an elite athlete. But I enjoyed running and I grew up with it. And I participated in secondary school in cross country for the first time, really liked it. I was a bit of a late bloomer, didn't break 5 minutes in the mile till I was about 17 or 18 years old. And then from there, and ran in college in Chicago in the Midwest in the United States, and ran cross country there all 4 seasons and really fell in love with the sport from that point on. When I came back home, I decided to become a teacher and became a history teacher and ended up coaching as a side effect and built up a team of runners, athletes, secondary school children, and ended up wanting to incorporate a little bit of history into their season yearbook. From there, I went online to poke around and find out what I could find out, and was pretty shocked that I couldn't find out very much. And so as part of my graduate school training, I took that liberty to go to university, open a few books, start perusing the archives, and was really surprised at what I found.
Yeah, I actually read somewhere, and correct me if this is wrong, that you had quoted that when you did start looking around, you came across about 3 lines in Wikipedia of the cross-country history, and that was it.
Exactly. And there were a few enthusiast websites, and they all had conflicting information and conflicting stories that didn't agree with each other. And from there, I was totally hooked, because at any time in history you find that information out that isn't in agreement, it raises a few eyebrows.
So are you a historian, or you're a teacher who's just really had a passion and delve into the writing of this book?
That's a great question. I was trained formally as a philosophy major in my undergraduate studies. And from there, I pursued a Master of Liberal Arts at Stanford in Palo Alto. But I was never formally trained as a historian. I've just always been avidly curious and avidly passionate about history and getting as many angles as possible and getting as many stories as possible. And so I felt like as a historian, I was more of a storyteller than I was an archivist or a statistician or something of that nature. But cross-country as a passion of mine really made sense in that respect.
So the book itself, so The Complete History of Cross-Country Running, did you always intend to pen that book, or just because of this interest of wanting to learn more about the history, you started to just investigate? How did it all come about?
Well, as I gathered information, I put it into chronological order, and I essentially got all of the major highlights that I was interested in that I think most people know about, right? The running boom in the 1970s, a few of the, kind of Cold War runners from the 1950s, a few of the turn of the century athletes whose names, registered in my memory. And of course, went as far back as I could to find out exactly where the sport started from. And with those kind of major peaks, I filled in the valleys along the way, and I kept everything in kind of chronological order with the intent of making it a brief history, not necessarily a complete history. And so from there, I understood that, once everything was done and put together, that I really couldn't stop filling in the gaps. And from there, it really became a passionate pursuit. And it just was so compelling that I found myself just moved to write the book out of necessity.
Yeah, it's funny you say that about, we all know these key parts in, I guess, modern running times, because when Brian and I started to discuss the history and I thought about it myself, we know a lot about the history of the Olympics and we know lots of stats around track runners, but I genuinely had really limited knowledge on cross country. And when I sat down to read your book, I reckon I knew not even 10% of the information that you had in the book. So you've done an amazing job on that. And I want to delve into that now and really the origins and where it began, and if you can take us back right to the beginning.
Sure. So what's fascinating about the story of cross-country running as a sport was that it originated almost exactly 200 years ago. And the very first record of what became cross-country running appeared in schoolboy journals that were kept in academies across England at the turn of the century in the early 1800s. And 1819 is generally seen as being the very first record of any sort of formal paper chase, what they considered to be the forebearer of cross-country running. They called this sport hare and hounds, and it involved chasing through the woods at breakneck speeds, leaving a trail of shredded paper so that other schoolboys could follow the trail, get lost on purpose, and eventually find themselves deep in the woods when the paper ran out. And once the paper ran out, they all sprinted back to the schoolhouse and they timed the entire event, and sometimes prizes were given for the first finishers. And this entire event was basically born out of imitation. And so at the turn of the century, back about 100 years prior, horse steeplechases, chases on horseback with hounds, and fox hunts of that nature were imitated by the younger class of elite schoolboys, and that's where hare and hound running by foot really took off.
Isn't it crazy? And so when you say, this paper chase, I was trying to picture it in my head when I was reading through the book. And was it literally just, like pieces of A4 paper torn into shreds and they just left them randomly throughout the woods?
Yes, it really was kind of like that. In fact, there's evidence that at some stage a very reputable paper chase took place when they shredded up a copy of the Latin primer textbook of a notoriously grouchy school administrator who cracked down on paper chasing. And so in retaliation, they shredded his textbook up into tiny little pieces of paper. And there's little bits and pieces of history that come about because of the transient nature of shredded paper on a pathway, which is to say the very first record of a formal championship conducted by club teams about a generation or two later after the first event was recorded involved a paper chase in the rain, and it was essentially washed out. The very first recorded cross-country championship was not run and not scored formally because no one could find the actual path with the paper washed away.
So when was this, around 1819, 1820s?
Well, the very first record of the race was in 1819, but 1876 was essentially the first championship run in England of any sort of notorious adult gentleman and amateur standing that was of note. And it took about a generation or two for these schoolboys to grow up and recognize that cross-country had, running through the woods had a lot of wonderful benefits for physiology.
And how did it go from being somewhat of like a fun imitation schoolboys game into like an organized type of event?
Well, for the same reasons that we love the sport today, it's an awful lot of fun to drink with your friends, drink with your mates, run through the mud, get dirty, get wet, and enjoy the romp through the woods. It was actually born out of a movement of leisure time activity that sprouted because of the Industrial Revolution and urban expansion in the Western world. So during the 1800s, there was economic classes that were born out of tradesmen, working class gentlemen, and of course the upper classes, which had more leisure time to spend. And so you see a lot of these sports, tennis and lawn bowling and croquet and polo and rowing, sprout out of this movement, and cross country was a byproduct of that. In the rowing season, in the off season, these fully grown schoolboys brought back the game to stay in shape in the winter months, and it became a thing of its own.
And so was it mainly like the upper class and the elite that played, or did cross country running in the beginning?
It was effectively a sport that was started by the gentleman amateur elites, those who had kind of a reputation and the money and the leisure time to spend on it. But it really took hold quickly and remained popular in schools and academies and universities in the Western world. And due to kind of the nature of expansion from the British Empire, really landed in such places as America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand around the same time at the turn of the 20th century.
And I must admit, I had absolutely no idea that, I guess around there, the 1880s, 1890s, that it did come to Australia. And I think when you read about something that's pretty much in your backyard, you get a bit excited about it. And I must admit, seeing that, in the 1880s, it came to New South Wales in Australia and has pretty much run since then is, it's fascinating. But also, we really do need to get this history out there because, as I said at the start, for someone who's run for so long, I genuinely had absolutely no idea. I love that it also then went to America in about the 1880s as well, and the New York Athletic Club was one of the first US clubs to organize meets.
Correct. So the New York Athletic Club in the United States is one of the most notoriously classic and traditional athletic clubs in America. And they really took hold in the 1880s as kind of a beacon of sorts for gentlemen to organize and run track and field and cross-country meets. And at the time, they started a bit of controversy when they decided to be kind of the forebearers of the sport and put their name on the inaugural individual cross-country championship in America. But a few things came about because of that, and it's an interesting little side note to the story of cross-country running as a whole.
Yeah, it still just blows my mind that it goes back so far. But one of the things that I really like about your book is that you do break it down literally every 10 years, and it's as though every 10 years it was evolving and something new and it was expanding. And then I guess, coming into the 1890s, and that's when the Olympic movement starts to kick off. And, in your book, you mentioned that the paper chasing is declining and it's starting to become more formalized racing and formalized distance and competitions. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So what kind of sprouted a love of cross-country running was, of course, like I mentioned, all the great things that we take for granted today, the running through the woods and, being with your teammates and running in groups and things like that. But around the turn of the century, the Olympic movement and formal organization in all respects of running and kind of standardization of all the events that we take for granted today, including the marathon, including the 10K, including, 5Ks on the track and things of that nature, even the steeplechase, which is kind of an oddity on the track. All of these things developed at the same time. And cross-country needed rules and formal regulations to govern the sport. And the forebearers of the Olympic movement brought in cross-country running into the 19-teens. The 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm were the first offering of the sport. And it was really a fascinating introduction to what at the time was kind of just the beginning stages of what we see today as the modern Olympic Games.
I want to talk about the Olympics actually for a little bit. And last week actually on the podcast, I was starting to read your book and I mentioned to Brian that the cross-country was in the Olympics back in sort of the early initial stages. And again, something that I didn't know. So can you just give us a little bit of a background onto when it was in the Olympics and the distances and what actually eventuated?
Absolutely. So at the turn of the century, England was really the first official country to embrace the sport as they had introduced it. And they attempted to organize international competition, but really it didn't take off in any sort of international fashion until well into the 1900s, well into the 20th century. And so at the turn of the century, when this was all starting, England felt that they were the best and the brightest at running, and they were to a certain degree. They tried to do some competitions with France, with Ireland and Scotland and Wales included. And it really wasn't such a performance of cross-country running as it was kind of the early stages of developing the sport. And so when they brought it into the Olympics, it was the English that had introduced it, but it was the international community that benefited. And what ended up happening was at the very first running of this event, it wasn't the English that prospered. It was the Swedish and Finnish teams, out of Finland and Sweden and the Nordic nations that really debuted their prowess. And it was the flying Finns that made a statement on the course. And of course, they were the first benefactors of racing it as an individual sport, but also as a team event where teams scored their top 3 runners instead of what we see today as the top 4 or top 5 or top 6. And so it was a really interesting side note. And of course, once it was in and out of the Olympics, it was only in 3 editions. But once it was out again, it took a while before other international countries were invited back to the World Championships.
And so in the initial Olympics, so 1912 in Stockholm, which first had the cross country, do you know how far it was that they actually raced? Brian asked me that last week and I didn't know.
Well, at the time, like I said, it was just beginning to become standardized. And so there wasn't this expectation of, oh, it has to be 10,000 meters, 10 kilometers, and we'll measure it to the yard. It really was, I think, 14 and a half kilometers of running outside of the stadium. And it was kind of like, come as you go with these rolling hillsides and kind of brush running and roadside running. And it wasn't formally on a cross-country course.
And so were they still trying to add in, the elements of water jumps and jumping over hedges? Did they still include that in those Olympics? Or was it just, there's the stadium, run around, 12 or 14 kilometers and come back in?
It was very much rough and tumble, and the European tradition of cross country has always been to include as many hazards as possible, and for that reason is seen as kind of the forebearer of the obstacle course movement that we see today, the Tough Mudder movement and things like that.
Yeah.
And in the Olympics, it was really kind of dangerous, and for the first iteration in 1912 and again in 1920 and 1924, there's great footage and photographs of Paavo Nurmi scaling brick walls and running through ditches and hedges, and it was very much kind of off-road running, very, very extreme. And there's a great story to be told about the 1924 Olympic cross-country event as well.
Yeah, well, let's tell it, because that was the last time that we've seen cross-country in the Olympics in Paris, 1924.
Yes, and we're coming up on the 100th year anniversary of the 24 Games, which is kind of exciting because they're back in Paris in 2024. And so in 1924, they raced, of course, the 3rd edition of the cross-country event. It was the final one on the athletics calendar, and Paavo Nurmi had been racking up medals left and right along the way, and he was by far probably the fittest distance runner to appear at the Summer Games that year. He raced, and he was one of only 15 finishers in this particular event. It just so happened that they raced this 12-kilometer cross-country course around the stadium in Paris on the hottest day possible. It was extremely hot. It was near 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it promoted exhaustion and heat stroke, and runners were collapsing left and right. There were reports of 3 dead, which is just insane to me to imagine that runners would just die while running cross-country, but very exciting. And of course, Nurmi's response to everyone collapsing was to say they trained poorly. But the footage from that event is kind of funny to watch because, you have runners who are breathing noxious fumes of a nearby factory and, of course, running into the wall on their entrance back into the Olympic Stadium to finish and crawling across the finish line and things that it really is compelling footage, but promptly brought cross-country back into the conversation as something extremely dangerous and taxing on the body and needed to be removed from the Olympics from that point forward. So unfortunately, the most extreme and exciting edition of cross-country running in the Olympics promoted its demise.
And so was that the rationale for excluding it? Did they think that it was too tough or too inhumane to actually continue with?
That was a popular decision at the time. And of course, women in running and distance running were also kind of a caveat note of the same period, which is to say, everyone was very concerned about the effects of distance running on the body. And so they banned any distance longer than 200 meters for women to run. And it was just quite the unscientific judgments of the time that brought about all this consultation.
It was probably well before, a lot of information on nutrition and hydration because, the Commonwealth Games, which I know that America doesn't compete in, was held in Australia last year and they did the marathon and I think it got up to nearly 30 degrees. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. And, there was a similar, I'm not sure if you've seen the footage, similar footage of the gentleman who was leading it, Callum Hawkins, who collapsed only a couple of kilometres from the finish line because of the heat. But I think, today we're a lot more well-versed in how to compete in hot conditions.
Yes, absolutely. And Callum is quite the cross-country runner himself. Yeah. And it wasn't so much a bad judgment at the time as it was just simply kind of a typical typical understanding of danger involved in what they were trying to promote with the Olympics. But for that reason, it was never brought back. And so what's interesting is there is a current discussion of getting cross country back into the Olympic Games, but this is a discussion that's been taking place for 100 years that most people don't know about.
I actually did listen to you on, I think it was the Hour of History podcast, and you touched on the potential of cross-country making a comeback in the 2024 Olympics in Paris. Is that correct?
Yes. There's an ongoing movement with the people who are really involved in the promotion of the sport. There is a formal association, the IAAF, which governs cross-country running among other track and field and marathon pursuits. And the members of those federations across the world that are part of the IAAF really want to see cross-country back into the Olympic Games. But it's an incredibly difficult promotion because the Council of the International Olympic Committee that makes those decisions has a lot on its plate, obviously getting ready for those games, and other sports need consideration as well. So cross-country is in the debate, but we're trying hard to get it to move forward.
And is this something that you're involved in? You're part of this discussion?
Well, I am very passionate about the sport, and so I'm in communication with a lot of those federation members. And of course, we're all on the right side at the moment to get this sport back into the Olympics, but it takes time, and so it's been an ongoing process. I don't want to say that I'm...
Well, look, I'm certainly all for the cross-country in the Olympics. I mean, they've got surfing coming up in Tokyo.
Right.
Which, if surfing can be in there, surely cross-country can be.
Right. And so I want to say that I'm a powerful grassroots mover and shaker, but I'm in no way holding the baton here. I really believe strongly that where these sports come from in terms of their popularity and their knowledge is really because the foundation of the sport is well known. Right. So for events like surfing and skateboarding and rock climbing, people can see it and fall in love with it, but they also know where it comes from and get excited about its major names and stars and things like that. And in cross country, someone really has dropped the baton when it comes to communicating how rich the history is and how long it is.
I agree 100% with you on that. And I actually am not a rock climber, but I've recently watched 2 movies, Into Thin Air, and there was another gentleman who did a maybe free solo, I think, on rock climbing. And it was just so encapsulating these movies. I wanted to go back and learn more about it. But, as a cross-country lover, I don't see anything like that coming out and hitting the movies and hitting mainstream media.
Right. And then that's where the movement came from on my end to say, you know what, I might as well write the book.
Yeah.
Prior to doing the history book, actually, I had, just for the benefit of sharing with the general public, put together a few montages called the Cross Country Running Anthology. That was kind of the preview to the story of cross country for me because it involved gathering a lot of these epic finishes and starts and races and compiling them into this slideshow of sorts that I put on YouTube. And then this was going back all the way to 2012. And so all of this momentum that I generated, I felt like needed to be put to good use. And so hopefully cross-country running will return to the Olympics. And there's a lot of good conversations happening on that front.
Oh, look, I hope it does. And you'll have to give me the links for those and we can pop them up on our socials and in the show notes as well so people can have a look. We can spread the love for cross-country around the world.
Yes. And for all those runners who are out there, really, all it takes is just to lace up your shoes and go for it. And so I'm really passionate about that. And I love the kinds of conversations you guys have been having on your show.
That's actually one of the things and the reasons why I love running too, is just the absolute simplicity of it. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why you see movements like parkrun, which I know over the world is literally going from strength to strength. And because it's as simple as you can do it anywhere, anytime, any place over the world. And, it's actually very accessible to countries that aren't as well off as some of Western cultures. So it breaks down a lot of barriers.
Absolutely. And cross country is kind of the great cousin of the park run. And I love seeing crowds come out and try it for the first time and really fall in love with it because there is a lot to love about it.
There really is. But just back on some of the history. So when I was reading through your book, I was actually quite surprised to see that far back as the 1920s, the African nations were involved in cross country because my perception of the African nations is it's only been, maybe in the past 30 30 years where they've really risen to prominence. But can you touch a little bit on how they sort of joined to cross-country, but it wasn't really the meteoric rise as we know the African nations today?
Right. Well, 2 points on the history of the African dominance in cross-country. The first being that, the British were really the messengers of the sport to the area in northern Africa and eastern Africa during the turn of the century period of colonization. The Germans and the Belgians as well had some influence, and they brought with them a lot of the westernized sports that we know today, games like soccer, football, and tennis, and of course, cross-country running and track and field, which they could informally practice with colonial association, but introduced the African nations to this movement and really had them fall in love with it. And so what we see today, kind of the benefit of this, the second part of things, is that Africa has a wonderful history of kind of agrarian, nomadic cultivation of the land and close association with the land that has been a generational aspect of their culture that they maximize to great benefit because track and field has been in their culture for more than 100 years and has been celebrated for more than 100 years as an official outlet and barometer of social influence. And so all the great athletes in East Africa, in Kenya and Ethiopia and Uganda and on, have frequently been distance runners who have made some sort of notorious claim on the track or the roads and sometimes in cross country to great acclaim and great fame and fortune. And so, whereas in the West we have football players and baseball stars and basketball stars, in East Africa they're almost all runners. And so it's celebrated there, really is.
Yeah, and I think it probably goes back to that point that you don't even need shoes. So, for some of the African countries where there isn't a lot of spare money to go around on the latest, Nike 4%ers, they can simply just go out, at the front door and run through some of the amazing landscapes that they have over there.
Yes, and it was almost by accident that they became so good because without great access to other forms of media or technology or high society, they were really promoted to run in order to survive. And their association, their community of runners is what keeps them at the top because the conversation is, well, East Africa isn't very wintry or muddy or foresty if you really think about it. But the Kenyan highlands are a wonderful example of just needing long stretches of dirt road at altitude to really foster a love of nature and become good at cross country, especially if you're doing it in groups.
And I think that's such a good point when you've got, not just a nation, but an entire continent that is focused predominantly on one sport. It's inevitable that you're going to have the best of the best.
Absolutely. And really it was through the 20s and 30s that it was introduced. The Second World War made quite an impact in the world at large as to who could participate in sports and what the climate was in terms of who was participating. But out of the post-war movement in the 1950s and 60s, we get our first kind of sign of international stardom from the East African countries of Kenya and Ethiopia as their athletes participate in Western games like the Commonwealth Games, like the Summer Olympic Games, and of course in universities across the world, and especially in the United States for the first time.
And speaking of the universities, so in Australia, we actually see quite a lot of the NCAA events, and especially the cross country. And I find this quite an interesting one because I've actually never gone over and run in America in the college system, but the depth that it looks like and that cross-country culture looks absolutely phenomenal. And it goes back to around the 1930s you mentioned in the book.
Yes, and so the sporting culture of the United States is kind of a paradigm of American culture on the whole, which is fascinated and obsessed with the latest and greatest. And you spend 30 seconds with an American and you can tell immediately just, kind of the showmanship apparent in all that we do. Everything has to be the biggest or the fastest or the best. It's just a byproduct of American society and has been for a long time. But what's fascinating about the sporting culture in the university system is that they built on this idea that at any cost necessary, they should be winning championships. And that extends all the way through cross-country teams. And from the beginning stages, international recruitment was a big issue, and Australia benefited greatly from this. Canada did as well, and some other nations, but so did the East Africans as they found themselves on these cross-country teams that they would never have been a part of 50 years previously.
So with NCAA and you've got that amazing, strong, not only individual competition, but the team side of it there just actually sometimes comes across as stronger than the individuals. Where does that stem from, and that love of cross country and that college system? Because, I mean, I'm not close enough to America, but it doesn't look like it continues on beyond college, and I might be wrong there.
No, it's a really fascinating aspect of American culture, and it kind of is to the detriment of American professionals who run that there isn't such a strong rivalry between club teams. That there are some very distinguished ones, and there is a little bit of a rivalry between certain coaches or athletes that see each other frequently. But the university system is built around competition. And so there's not only a storied tradition with teams that see each other frequently. I mean, we're talking about schools and universities who have really deep and storied rivalries. And in some parts of the United States, you know, you can really tell at the dinner table who went to what school and who's talking to whom because of it. But it goes beyond just cross-country running that, you know, these athletes are kind of raised to look at the other schools in their conference or in their area as being idealistically their rivals to the core, you know, that they're expected to beat them every season, that they're expected to outrace them, and that certain traditions promote certain teams to be dominant year after year. Well, in that landscape, you get wonderful streaks of teams that find themselves at the top of the mountain in cross country, literally, and winning championships again and again. And of course, coaches who hang on to their programs, you know, create legacies of their own. And at different points in the story of writing the history of cross country running, it was really apparent that the coach and the culture of the team was what separated the great from the good. And it really wasn't a factor of anything special beyond those two factors.
I will actually just ask you mentioned that you went to Stanford University. Did you participate in the cross-country program whilst you were there?
So I entered Stanford as a graduate student, and so I had used all my eligibility for college running at that point, but I was still connected to the culture at Stanford, and it was a wonderful experience to be associated with the team with such a close proximity, because Stanford was kind of an Ivy League program on the West Coast that had a long tradition of its own. And so it made sense to be studying these stories and these histories and these traditions in the same confines as a place that still had a storied tradition and was going on right outside my window. So I never participated on their team, and they have a really good program. But it was great to have that exposure, and they post some phenomenal meets, including a cross-country invitational and a few track and field invitationals that are just really standout events.
And so once you finish college in America and you've come out of that system, where can you go if you want to continue to run cross-country?
So what's fascinating about the American professional system is that it's largely governed by shoe brands and clothing companies who put money forward for marketing purposes, just as much as it is to finance, you know, athletes who are still at the best that they're ever going to be and still competing at a high level. So what is interesting about the story of cross-country running as a sport is that the earliest programs and groups to organize did so for the love of the game. And that kind of amateur movement was what was recognized as being a cornerstone of cross-country running for generations and generations. And if you were going to join teams like the New York Athletic Club or the Manhattan Athletic Club, it was not because a shoe company was sponsoring you in your next marathon. And so the professional culture of running really took hold in the 1970s and 80s when organizations that were promoting purely amateur competition changed their rules for the first time and allowed athletes to make money as professional runners. And for much of the story of cross-country running, which to that point had been about 150 years, it really was a story of people who did it because they loved it. It really wasn't a story of people looking to make any sort of money at all about competing, including prize winnings, which were completely off the table. And so today in America, if you want to compete on a professional running club, then you have to outperform your peers to a great extent. It really is the top 1% and 2% of athletes who go on to run professionally and actually earn a paycheck. Now, there are a lot of athletes. Yes, there are a lot of athletes today who do organize with community groups and in their local cross-country clubs and running clubs to continue running for the sake of the sport. Some are more productive and competitive than others. However, the climate for running professionally is changing, and this has really taken hold in the last 10 years, which is to say, we're seeing more and more groups organizing with better athletes who are doing so not because a shoe brand is sponsoring them, but because they identify with the culture of the community that they're in and they want to keep competing.
So do you think that the 1970s was like the real heyday of cross country, which, was Steve Prefontaine's era, which I know in the US, or do you think it came a bit before that in the 1950s where, post-war there was a lot more leisure time, there was a lot more freedom, broadcasting became the norm? Where do you think the real boom of cross country really took off?
I think there's a sweet spot when you think about the running movement as a whole that goes beyond just cross country, but also in marathon running and track and field, and even in trail running and kind of pure outliers of the sport as well. And that really took place in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Now, the reason for that was because the sport was just about moving to a professional status in a lot of those areas. Road running had really taken off and become a more culturally acceptable movement for fitness. And there was just a plethora of wonderful international stars from all over the world who were on the same stage at the same time. Now, the 1950s and 60s and 70s had wonderful characters, and it really built the momentum for what happened in the late 70s and early 80s. But there's a sweet spot of just after Steve Prefontaine's appearance that we see basically every nation represented across the world at the same time in a competitive fashion. That was just, it was a wonderful experience to learn about and to talk to athletes about who still, quite remember what that experience was like.
Yeah, that's quite true, isn't it? I mean, here locally in Australia, that the 1980s was very, very much dominated by Robert De Castella, who had great battles with, a lot of the Africans, a lot of the US. And as you mentioned, there was, it wasn't just one nation dominating at, world titles, Olympics, etc. There was always a handful of people from different countries that could actually come out on top.
Exactly. And so the competitive nature of the sport was at its peak, I believe, towards the end of the 1970s and early 1980s. And there was a considerable drop-off that happened in the mid-1980s and 1990s, which was really to the detriment of the sport because it became kind of a different convergence of sorts that detracted from the popularity of the sport and really hurt the chances of distance running to become more popular. We're seeing a rebound right now, which is great, but it's been a long and slow climb out of that valley of what happened as a result of seeing all these famous runners and great champions at the same time towards the end of the 70s and early 80s.
And so what do you actually think was the cause of that decline in the early 90s?
Well, you had a less than fantastic running plethora of champions to choose from. You had a lot of great stable names that were champions in the 80s that were reaching their prime or had peaked and were coming down, but there weren't a lot of new runners to carry the mantle. And really that was a reflection of culture as a whole, which had transitioned from less than accessible premier sports to more accessible premier sports. And what I mean by that is to say in the 1960s and 70s, if you were a distance runner, it was popular because it was just accepted that if you didn't play football or didn't play baseball, you were pretty much running the entire time outside of those activities. But popular sports became more politicized and celebrated and more accessible through the 1980s, and by the 1990s, the culture of distance running wasn't as dramatic or as powerful as it had been, and there were less people participating in distance running than before.
I guess it was possibly around the time when a lot of professionalism of other sports started to kick in, and so that probably didn't happen. And here in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same in America, that especially for men, they can join, so I guess, team sports and make a great living out of it, whereas unfortunately in running it's still not quite the same.
Right. And you had the emergence of East African nations in a big way due to a subsidy program that the IAAF instituted in the early 1980s to help pay for developing countries to participate. And so more and more Africans were participating at the top levels, and less notable Western athletes were participating at the same rate. And it really impacted the nature of what people were watching when they were paying attention to track and field and marathon running and cross country, right? They were looking on the screen, they were seeing less and less Western actors from both genders. And it really became a difficult proposition to say, well, if I'm, from a Western community, do I want to be a runner or do I want to play another sport?
And so that's interesting. I didn't know that point around the IAAF with the assistance of, I guess, the less fortunate countries. And was it sort of an Africa-specific movement that they did, or did they do it with other developing countries?
There were a number of offered, I don't want to say per diems or scholarships, but it was an incentive program that was initiated because of the new track and field format that was replacing kind of a bigger meet Grand Prix that was organized in the 1970s. And it was part of a program that was intended to professionalize the ranks and bring more exposure to it. I think there were a few media contracts that were held, bidding wars, if you will. And so in order to publicize the sport and make it more international, that's when these invitations were given. And I'm not sure if it was a worldwide movement, like they extended it to countries like Argentina or Guatemala, but I do know that Kenya and Ethiopia were benefactors of this movement because they were really brought into the limelight and they remained there for a good amount of time. And it's my personal belief that if you want to measure the success of a distance running culture in a country, only look to their world cross country performances, and that will show you who's dedicated at the top ranks during that period.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's quite true that maybe that 90s and then into the 2000s, there was maybe a bit of an underlying current of, well, the Africans are just going to dominate, so, maybe why bother? But it seems like, and I'm not sure whether or not this is me being gender biased here, but the women sort of stood up and said, the bar's been raised, so let's try and compete against them. And, certainly like the American women, Emma Coburn, Shalane Flanagan, they're right up at the top. They're up there competing with the Africans.
Right. And it's a wonderful dichotomy of the sport, because what's fascinating about cross country specifically is that of all the distance running events, it was a very outdated and antiquated understanding of the game, quote unquote, of cross country that enabled women to benefit the most from competition. And today we look back and we criticize the movement of the organizations in charge of keeping women running less distance. But this is the great elephant in the room today, which is to say, for generations and generations, it was understood and accepted that women would run less distance than men for the same cross-country competitions. And it went on for more than 100 years. Now, France was really the first country to make an egalitarian effort to include women in cross-country running. And there's a wonderful tradition in France of getting women to participate in male-driven sports. But in cross-country running specifically, it was understood that women would run less than men, and it was expected that they would just compete under those circumstances until something changed. And it really took Seb Coe coming into prominence as the head of the IAAF to really notice this difference and make a deal about it and say, you know what, we really are going to organize a 10K for men and women to be unanimously run, which I believe is the best move because it's the only event of its kind on the athletics calendar where women are running less for the same events as men are.
Yeah, it is bizarre, and it's only within the last couple of years where even here in Australia, our major championships and even just, the local schools championships, it was always that difference. The men would run in the Opens 12 kilometres and the women would run 8, and in the juniors the men would do 8 and the girls would do 6. And there's really no need for it. It's quite crazy that it's taken up until, I guess, in the 2000s for that to actually change.
Right. And what's wonderful about it is that it's kept Western nations competitive. In fact, it brought in, more competition and more conversation about the competition than before, because prior to this, it was just understood that, well, do I want to be a middle distance runner? Do I like running the mile? If I run cross country, is it going to benefit me? And more women were joining cross country teams and speaking out because it was benefiting them, and they were so competitive. And Paula Radcliffe was one of the great names in the early 2000s to challenge the Ethiopians. And there was a lot of momentum for women to compete at such a high level.
Well, I mean, we've even got here in Australia Benita Willis, who I think it was maybe 2004, she won the World Cross Country Championships. And I've just finished listening to a podcast where she was interviewed on this the last couple of weeks. And she just had such an innate belief that she was just as good as the Africans. There was no reason why a woman from Australia couldn't be up at the top and competing against them. So, I love that mentality. And I think we see it in today's, the World Cross Country was just held recently, and strong teams were sent from a lot of, non-African nations. And although Africa did prevail in the end, there was certainly still some good results from non-African nations.
Absolutely. And Australia has a wonderful history of athletes who compete and perform on the biggest stages better than they ever were predicted to. And there are a few instances where New Zealanders won the World Cross Country team titles out of nowhere, seemingly nowhere. And wonderful, wonderful history of Australian athletes competing and finishing much higher than expected. In fact, Pat Tiernan, who was a wonderful Australian team member and ran in the NCAA in America, was the top non-African finisher a few years ago at the 2017 World Cross Country Championships. And, I care about these things, and maybe a handful of others do, but many Westerners overlook the fact that Pat did such a good job after a season where he won the NCAA title over Edward Cheserek, this really powerful, Kenyan transplant into the United States. And so there's so many stories like that, and it's really fascinating.
It is. But I'll touch on at the moment the World Cross Country, because I think it's an interesting one to talk about. It's been around for nearly 100 years, I think. You'll correct me on exactly how long it is, but it's been around for a long time. But in 2011, it seemed to get into a bit of trouble with only one nation wanting to actually hold the event, and then them turning it to biennial. Where do you see the place for World Cross?
The forebearer of World Cross Country was essentially the English movement to organize the sport, and for a good chunk of time, about 30 years actually, it really was a 5-nation competition between England, France, Belgium, and the surrounding Great British countries on occasion, it was Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. It wasn't until the 1930s that they brought in some other outliers, and it was an invitation only through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where countries like Italy, Portugal, the United States, Canada made an appearance. In the 1970s, the IAAF organized the sport formally, and that invited everyone who was in the rotation in the athletics calendar to become members, participate, and obviously host the competition. In the early 2000s, we see a big problem with countries that wanted to host it, because to do so is a very expensive endeavor. And through the 1980s and 90s, the East African nations were so dominant that Western countries essentially stopped sending their athletes. They said, what's the point of competing with Kenya and Ethiopia every year if they just trounce us? And that was the absolute wrong mentality to have. And of course, they would never openly admit that they were, not sending athletes for these reasons. But the importance of cross-country really declined because there was less appreciation given for the sport, and too much attention brought about to the competitive nature of the East African countries and their place in the sport. And so with this lack of attention, there was less momentum, and less momentum meant less participation, and less participation meant less money. And so while there were some wonderful events that were held in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were not a lot of bidders into the process of wanting to host this event. And as such, it became a biennial event, and it bounced around a lot, and less people wanted to participate, even more so because they saw it as being a secondary event that wasn't being held in the Olympics anymore. It was being held every other season. Why do the thing if they didn't want to participate? So what World Cross Country needed, because it was the only place on the athletics calendar where you could get a miler and a marathoner to line up next to each other and compete at the highest level over a predetermined distance. In order to resuscitate the sport, they needed an event that celebrated the history, that made the athletes the focus, made the course the focus, because a cross-country course is a wholly unique thing wherever it is held in the world. And Aarhus in Denmark said, you know what? We are going to lift the mantle of the sport, and we are going to do the best that we can to create a world cross-country event that is second to none, that the world has never seen. we're gonna capitalize on all the things that made cross country wonderful: the mud running, the sand pits, the steep hills. We want to make it an insufferable event. We want to include beer into the mix because, of course, adult beverages are always a celebration. And we want to create a tradition and a legacy that imparts a little bit of the Nordic history, a little bit of the Viking heritage, and a little bit of the excitement that has been brought about for 200 years of running that people don't even know about. And they sought out to create such an elaborate event that on paper, it just seemed too good to be true. It was one of those things that kept unraveling and unraveling and unraveling.
Did you get out there at all, or did you watch it on the live stream?
So I found myself in a personal position where I had circled the date on my calendar and was planning to go. And of course, unforeseen setbacks prevented me from being there in person. But I was in communication with the team in Denmark throughout the process. They were kind enough to give me some input even on the design of the World Cross Country medals that were handed out, which I thought was very cool.
Oh, wow.
And very kind of them. And they took influence of all the work that I had done to impart a heritage exhibit about the 200-year history of cross-country running, and included the earliest accounts from Shrewsbury School in England, and brought in the huntsman of the run in Shrewsbury to announce the junior men's race, which I thought was a fantastic incorporation of the history. And they had all the great names there and all the great memorabilia on display. And it really became an exhibit of sorts that athletes and fans and spectators got to witness throughout the entire event.
That's amazing. Well, we've got quite a keen interest at the moment, given that the next edition in 2021 is literally in my backyard in Bathurst in Sydney. It's about a 2-hour drive from central Sydney where I live. And I'm definitely keen to get out there, and just listening to some of the organisers with some initial ideas. And they've been talking about having like a general public type of event in some sort, so that, you know, that park run movement that's coming through can experience, I guess, the course that then the elites are going to follow on and run with. So that would be something amazing. But have you got anything to do with that, the Australian Bathurst version?
The next edition of World Cross Country is going to be a pivotal opportunity to create momentum, even more momentum than was generated in Denmark. And I'm doing everything possible to include myself in those conversations. And I have some great ideas of my own that the team that is organizing them have taken into consideration, which is very flattering. One of those being that the event itself is supposed to be held in March, which is traditionally a winter month or early spring month for most of the Western world. And of course, in Australia is pretty much in the middle of summer or towards the end of summer for you guys, where it's pretty warm, as I've heard, close to 28 degrees Celsius for you guys. And one of my first opportunities to impart some suggestions went to the effect of, can they hold the event at night to kind of dissipate the effect that the heat will have on a competition that's intended to run over 10,000 kilometers over hill and dale. So what ends up happening to the event and how they end up hosting it will be a wonderful marker of the status of the sport in 2 years, but it might provide a few opportunities to do things in the sport that have never been done before. And so one of the opportunities for competition might be to host the event in the evening hours to kind of help mitigate the effect of the heat and the summer weather that is present in the Southern Hemisphere at that time of year, because the event of cross country is traditionally supposed to be in the winter months. And of course, in Australia, in March, it's going to be quite warm. However, it has never been held at night before, and it will never have an opportunity to be held in an environment like this, consistently. And so why not take advantage of the opportunity and make it the most exciting event possible?
I think it would be amazing. Have you actually ever run a night cross country before?
I have. And when I was coaching my athletes, teenagers, most of them, it was quite the treat to circle on the calendar and say, this event is special because it's going to be held at night, because it's a rare thing to have in cross country, but it's not unheard of. And it adds a sort of exciting element to it because it's so rare and it's special that way.
I've only ever done one at night, and I must admit I loved it. So I think it would be, as you say, something special and something very rare.
Well, and I think it makes for good watching. It's kind of an exciting event because there's moments in a race at night that just, everything's glorified under the lights, I think. So
I agree. So where do you think cross-country is heading? Because, from my standpoint, you've got this amazing movement of mid-packers who's you described yourself as, and that's what Brian and I are, and, general public who'd like to participate in, fun runs are booming, park runs are booming, even, NCAA events and our local school cross countries are, heavily participated in. But at that pointy end, there just seems to be a lack of sponsorship, a lack of coverage, and then maybe even a lack of pathway for professionalism for the athletes.
Right, exactly. And so how do you combat this malaise that has taken hold with cross-country running in particular, which is to say there's a lot of other opportunities for the common runner to participate. And for most people, cross-country running isn't necessarily on their radar, although the forebearers of cross-country, all of these park runs and obstacle course runs and mud runs and things of that nature are planting the seed in people's minds that, wow, there is an opportunity to be competitive, and it's an awful a lot of fun. And so my standpoint is to say, in the last 20 to 30 years, there's a lot of judgment about the sport in a few negative ways that are easily transferable into positive ways. And if the sport is really in a valley, then it's certainly climbing out of that valley with events like what we saw in Denmark for the World Cross Country Championships and in the recent, NCAA championships and other events that are really promoting a great record of the sport and celebrating the traditions of the sport. And the problems that plagued it 20 years ago are not so much the problems that we're seeing today. What will really make a difference for most people with cross-country running is if it's treated seriously. Mm-hmm. And all the efforts that we can promote to bring it back into the Olympic conversation, I think, are valid and will hopefully lead to an inclusion of cross-country either in the summer or the Winter Olympic Games, which I think would be a harder job to pull off, but would be equally exciting. And there's a few good reasons to have it in both. The first is that, cross country ran in the Summer Olympics in the 19-teens and 20s, and we're just coming into the 100th year anniversary of bringing it back there, which I think would be great. And in the Winter Olympics, it would give an opportunity for athletes who run from Kenya and Ethiopia and East African nations to make a scene in the Winter Olympic Games, which is a place where they're not usually well represented in events like bobsledding or cross-country skiing or the like in figure skating. And so conversations are taking place in both arenas to the extent that cross-country running should be included. How will it be included? What will the presentation be like? And who will be a part of it? Those are the answers that we're looking for now. And all of this good momentum is just bringing the sport back into prevalence and power.
Look, I think you're right in that Olympic piece because the Olympics get funding when it comes around that time from bodies, government bodies, and obviously then there's that mainstream media element, and there's I guess they say there's no bad publicity, don't they?
Exactly, and what cross country needs are a few good actors, good characters to follow in the storyline that people can get excited about in all ages. And there was a big hullabaloo made about certain athletes who competed in Aarhus, notably Jacob Ingebrigtsen, who's an up-and-coming 17, 18-year-old runner from Norway, yep, who set all kinds of junior-level records and went toe-to-toe with East Africans. And, of course, all the media pundits said that his name was talked about too much in the broadcast when other notable junior runners from East African nations were running really well. But the inspiration that characters and athletes of his nature provide for the common media watcher does volumes for the sport, regardless of how they perform. And what I notice the most is that among the youth ranks, the sport is still growing and continues to grow and continues to provide for a host of young people and young athletes the world over.
You make a really good point around the characters because in Australia here, probably one of the most dominant sports is Australian rules football, AFL. And, I have friends who have played the sport and they actually get media coaching and help and assistance on how to present in the media and how to put themselves out there. And, it's something that I see is quite lacking in cross country and athletics. These poor young kids get asked for an interview after one of their competitions, and they're probably just so shy and nervous that they haven't got that ability to really connect with the audience. And I think there's a real opportunity to assist them with that, to get those characters out into the public eye.
Absolutely. And the more that we do to grow the sport and keep the conversation going, the better it will do in the future. And everyone who's participating at our level now is doing the utmost that they can to ensure that it continues to thrive for another 200 years. Mm-hmm. And how that appears, in the record books will be a very important process, because what we're seeing right now, regardless of what it's perceived to be, is authentically a great effort to memorialize the sport and promote the sport. And so if we can get, more media events on the schedule and training for athletes and coverage of the sport, that would be tremendous. And of course, there's a ton of opportunity in Australia to get people exposed to the events and get their knowledge up to speed so they can talk about the current champions and the current traditions. And I really think there's a basis for building on something spectacular to happen for cross country in the coming years.
Yeah, and look at things that people like you have done, and you've written the history. You're out there talking about it. You can tell that you're genuinely passionate about it, and I think that's really what the sport needs. Instead of a lot of negative connotations, as you say, let's turn those conversations into positive ones. Get out there into the mainstream media and public, and really promote what is actually a very healthy, encouraging, and a sport that can be participated by all classes, all levels. So I think it's very inclusive.
Absolutely. And it's my pleasure to bring attention to this, because I think it's the first step in a process of education and knowledge building for most people who, like yourself and like everyone who I've encountered so far, to say, wow, this is really remarkable stuff. Why didn't I learn about it in primary school? They should be teaching a course on it. I agree. Yes. But also the understanding that it's going to take more than just a single person and the history of the sport to make it great. And the community effort that it promoted and continues to promote is just fantastic. And the organizations that are in Australia and elsewhere that are doing everything to bring attention to the new events. The World Championship in 2021 is going to be amazing. I can't wait. I've circled it again. I'm coming out there. I don't care what happens in 2 years. I'll be on a plane to Sydney, and it's going to be glorious.
Oh, good. Well, maybe we can, if they put in the race for the mid-packers, maybe you and I and Brian can battle it out across the course and see who comes up trumps.
I would love that. I would love it. And it would be my pleasure to come out and meet you guys. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about cross country today.
Oh, no worries. Well, where can people reach you? Where can they buy the book? Give the listeners some info so that they can go out and learn more about cross country.
Sure, absolutely. The book is called The Complete History of Cross Country Running. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on most wholesale book dealers online. I run the website therealxc.com, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram under the same handle, The Real XC, The Real Cross Country. Find me on Facebook and just reach out. The more people that talk about the sport, mid-packers like us, will continue to dominate, and eventually we'll catch those Africans at the top.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, I'll link all of those up into the show notes so people can find you and reach out to you. And thank you so much for joining me. I've taken up enough of your time, but I honestly could keep talking about this all day.
Well, I really appreciate it. Me too. And we'll have another opportunity, I'm sure, in the future to rekindle the conversation and bring it back on the advance notice of Australia hosting the 2021 World Cross Country Championships.
Thanks very much, Andrew.